Hi all, welcome to week 2 of Special Education 671, Advanced Study of Literacy Problems. This video is going to provide a brief review of some of the topics we discussed last week, as well as a discussion of literacy from a developmental perspective. So if we return to last week, you may recall that I suggested educators must understand reading processes. And by that, I meant we have to understand what's going on in our minds cognitively, in particular, when we read. And that reading models provide a way of representing what's going on in our head at any one moment while we're reading. They include word perception, sentence processing, and text comprehension to be a comprehensive model. One of the models we looked at was by Hollis Scarborough, The Many Strands That Are Woven into Skilled Reading. It talks about two primary components, language comprehension and word recognition. Importantly, language comprehension becomes more strategic as comprehension strategies become more strategic, and word recognition becomes more automatic, thereby freeing up more cognitive attention for comprehension. Marianne Wolf says the greatest gift of reading is time to think. The Scarborough model aligns nicely with the Goff and Tunmer model, the simple view of reading, which is a mathematical model, and they suggested that reading comprehension is the product of decoding and language comprehension. And importantly, it's not an additive relationship, but a multiplicative relationship. In other words, if either decoding or language comprehension is 0, there is absolutely no reading comprehension. The utility of this model, I think, is in helping us to very, very simply think about kids who are struggling to read, in that they may have decoding problems, they may have language comprehension problems, or they may have both. Again, that's the simplest way of thinking of it, but a way of sort of sorting out some of the challenges that kids face. Secondly, I propose that educators must have knowledge of English orthography. In other words, they need to know how the English writing system came to be, and that in fact it reflects a variety of historical influences, which Baer et al. Categorize as alphabet layer, pattern layer, or meaning layer. As we looked at last week, those words that come from Old English include one-syllable words, function words, very, very common words, words that were important in that time for the people who were living. Issues like rain, like earth, like sky, like sun, like mother, like goat, all sorts of things that were important for their existence. With the invasion of the French came some more aristocratic language, representing some values and ideals, in particular the soft C and the soft G and other long vowel combinations. And then during the Renaissance, when there needed to be new vocabulary to represent artistic and scientific discoveries and ideas, we entered into more multisyllable words with Latin roots and Greek combining forms. Baer et al. Suggests that organizing their curriculum, which includes phonics, spelling, and vocabulary, as a part of word study, again, we're not looking at comprehension here, but only individual words, can be organized according to these same historical layers, and that provides a systematic guide for instruction. They continue, as students learn to read and write, they appear to reinvent the system as it was itself reinvented. not completely a new idea. You can see Gleitman and Rosen in 1973 suggested that children's developmental change is analogous to historical change. So the question is, what does that developmental change look like? How are children reinventing the writing system? And what does literacy development look like? Should be look like. And how do we know what it looks like? Well, we know what it looks like from about 40 years or more of research. Two people who were very instrumental in helping us understand the writing system were Carol Chomsky and Charles Reid, both linguists. Carol Chomsky was at Harvard and Charles Reid at the University of Wisconsin. And they looked at, from a linguist perspective, children's invented spellings. And they proposed that their spellings were not arbitrary, but in fact reflected a systematic representation of sounds. In other words, kids were not memorizing the way words looked. It wasn't a visual task, but it was a language task, and that how they represented sounds was a window into their word knowledge. Henderson, the person to whom Words Their Way is actually dedicated, Edmund Henderson at the University of Virginia, did extensive studies on children's spellings and how those spellings changed over time, suggesting that children first use single letters, then letter patterns, then word parts to represent sounds and eventually to represent meaning. So the stages that we're talking about, the phases that we are talking about in terms of writing development are well researched and well documented. In the area of reading, which is a corollary to writing, Marie Clay, or Marie Clay, I think as it's pronounced, from New Zealand, did multiple observations of young children reading. Again, children who are just beginning to learn how to read and access text. And she wrote The Early Detection of Reading Difficulties, a Diagnostic Survey and Reading Recovery Procedures. She was one of the early people to take a good hard look, or one of the early people to take a good hard look at reading difficulties, what we're sort of focusing on in this class. And she suggested that planned observations can capture evidence of early progress. She talked a lot about children's concepts of print. In other words, do they understand that there are spaces between words? Do they know that you start at the left side and move to the right, that you start at the top and move to the bottom? All these sort of concepts about print, which we'll talk about later in this session. And she also was a person who started recording children's miscues. In other words, their reading errors, what she called a running record. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with running records, and how those running records are really good diagnostic information and can help us understand, again, children's word knowledge. She was the one who developed Reading Recovery. Probably many of you are familiar with Reading Recovery, which is an intervention program for first graders. Last week, I showed you Jean Shaw and her stages of reading development. She also was someone who contributed substantially to this idea of reading changing over time. And in some ways, kids get better and better at the same things, and in some ways there are qualitative shifts. So she suggested the first stage was stage 0, pseudo-reading or memory reading. Kids are able to retell a story from pictures, maybe print their name, probably be able to identify and name some of the letters of the alphabet. And then initial reading and decoding, which is grade 1 and beginning 2, ages 6 to 7 typically. And it's where they begin to learn the relationship between letters and sounds, and between print and spoken word. Not an easy accomplishment. Stage 2, confirmation of fluency, is generally around grades 2 to 3, and it's really consolidating, a word you'll hear again and again today, decoding, sight vocabulary, and context. And when you put all those three things together, that's one of the ways that you're able to accomplish and become a more fluent reader. When you get to stage 3, it's no longer learning to read, but you've probably heard this, learning to read, but rather reading to learn. Stage 4 is looking at multiple viewpoints. This tends to occur in high school. And then finally, construction and reconstruction, which considers the characteristics of adult readers. And although there's not a one-to-one match between spelling and reading, note that reading has the added advantage of context. There is a relationship between the two. And so these were sort of the early people looking at developmental perspective. Reading researchers began to explore the relationship between reading and spelling and the development of reading and spelling, and trying to identify very specific qualitative changes. And in many instances, this was motivated by the desire to help children who were struggling to learn how to read. One of those people who was interested in dyslexia, as it was called, as it is still referred to, was Uta Frith. And she suggested that early writing is symbolic, that's scribbling, that then early reading is logographic. In other words, you use graphic features, maybe the first letter in context, or you use it as a logo, as a sign, as an icon. But then you shift, and it's a real qualitative shift when you begin using the sounds of the language and paying attention to the sounds of the language and understanding that they are represented by the letters, by the graphemes. And so that is sort of an alphabetic stage, and then moving into an orthographic stage, which is putting some of those letters together and seeing them not as individual letters, but as chunks of letters, and eventually as meaningful word parts. Another person who was very instrumental, another researcher very instrumental in reading and spelling development, was Airy. Airy proposed really 4 stages or phases of reading development: pre-alphabetic, early alphabetic, later alphabetic, and there's that word consolidated, alphabetic. And they kind of looked like this. Pre-alphabetic, that sort of pseudo reading of Shaw's, reading by visual features. Early alphabetic, beginning to use sound symbol correspondences and using the alphabet to represent those sounds. Later alphabetic, more complete phonemic awareness. And this is a time when what Shaw called being glued to the print. In other words, sounding out each and every word in an effort to really learn those sound symbol correspondences, and then using not only those sound symbol correspondences, but patterns to read and spell words. The book that we're looking at by Baer et al. Organizes them very similarly. Emergent reading and spelling, letter name alphabetic spelling with inward pattern spelling, transitional reading, syllables and affixes, intermediate reading, and derivational relations, and advanced reading. And as we talked about last week, following that same alphabet pattern meaning development of the English orthography. I'm going to go through these next slides fairly quickly. They each include, I believe, an example of the writing of the stage, as well as a description. And then we'll go into each of these in more detail in the next few weeks. The first stage, as described by Baer et al., is the emergent stage, ages 2 through 5, pre-phonetic. The next stage is the letter name alphabetic stage, using letter names to invent spellings and typically representing first the beginning sounds and then the end of sounds, more fully developed concepts of print. The within word pattern stage in which kids begin to spell chunks of letters and start using letter patterns like the silent E, like the two vowels together, or like two vowels with sort of ambiguous sounds, or one vowel with an ambiguous sound, actually, and they begin reading more fluently. You can see in this one the use of the silent E to mark a long vowel in the middle of the word. Syllables in affix stage, able to spell most single words correctly, working to read multi-syllable words and derivational relations, then really beginning to use those word parts both for spelling and pronunciation. An example in this particular writing sample, as a teacher, what you might say to the student is, what other word do you know that sounds like favorite? And they might say favor, and the favor would help them correctly spell the word favorite. So that is just an overview of the reading and spelling stages that we're going to be talking about in Words Their Way. I gave you the other reading models because a stage by any other name is still a stage. And so although Frith and Arian Snolling and Barrett all call them different things, please know they are referring to the same set of characteristics. So logographic, similar to pre-alphabetic, similar to emergent, orthographic, similar to consolidated alphabetic, and syllables and affixes, and going beyond that, even perhaps derivational relations. So just didn't want you to get mixed up or think that people were talking about different things when truthfully they are not. So I want to end with just a question to you. I want you to think about, so why is this important? Why is an understanding of literacy development important? And I would hope, you might answer by thinking about how it informs instruction, perhaps why it makes instruction more efficient and more effective, and particularly for kids who are really struggling, perhaps being able to identify when some of those spelling errors or some of those reading miscues are not typical, and what that means in terms of your own intervention.